While you often hear the two terms used interchangeably, are Irish mythology and Celtic mythology the same thing? The short answer? No, they're different. The longer answer? While they're not synonyms, Irish mythology and Celtic mythology are connected. There are two ways we can think about this, and that's because there are two ways one can interpret the meaning of Celtic mythology. Now, if the first thing that pops into your head when you think of Celtic mythology is a dude with gigantic antlers sprouting out of his skull, then you're effectively interpreting Celtic mythology to mean Gaulish mythology. Ancient Gaul, which consisted of modern-day France, Belgium, northern Italy, western Switzerland, and parts of the Netherlands and Germany, was the home turf of the Gaulish or Gallic-speaking Celts. That dude with the antlers who's often depicted wearing a torque and sitting cross-legged, he's the ancient Celtic/Gallo-Roman nature god Cernunnos. And while there are dozens of depictions of Cernunnos spread across Europe, the overwhelming majority of them appear in northeastern Gaul. Indeed, there is a whole pantheon of deities centered in Gaul, including Tyrannus, god of thunder, who's been called the Gaulish Jupiter, Tutatis, tribal protector god, aka the Gaulish Mars, Ogmios, god of eloquence/club-wielding hero who's been described as an older version of Hercules, Lugus, the many-skilled god who's been called the Gaulish Mercury, Belenus, who may or may not be a sun god, but regardless he's been called the Gaulish Apollo, Gobanus, the smithing god comparable to Vulcan, Succulus, god of agriculture and prosperity who's been called the Gaulish Dispater, and Epona, the horse goddess and possible leader of souls, aka Psychopomp, whose cult became so popular that between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE she was worshipped not only across the Roman Empire, but in Rome itself. Now, it is absolutely valid to refer to the aforementioned gods as Celtic gods, and by extension, it's valid to refer to stories about said gods as Celtic mythology. The ancient Gauls were Celtic speakers after all. What's more, for much of antiquity, the Gauls were the Celts, at least according to their Greco-Roman neighbors. As archaeologist Barry Cunliffe notes in his book Druids, A Very Short Introduction, in classical texts, the names Gauls and Celts were often used interchangeably. Granted, the ancient Gauls didn't really write much down, which was due in large part to a Druid-enforced taboo on writing down sacred knowledge, so most of the information we have concerning the mythical exploits and interminglings of Gaulish deities, like the horned god Cernunnos and the horse goddess Epona, and the agricultural god Succulus, from whom the Gauls believed all Gauls were descended, will that factoid be relevant in a few seconds? Maybe. Comes from surviving inscriptions and descriptions given by classical writers and conquerors, like Julius Caesar. Source material aside, when we take this view of Celtic mythology with its focus on the Gaulish pantheon, it's easy to see what makes it different from Irish mythology. Irish mythology is from Ireland. Its stories are set, for the most part, in and around Ireland, and it has its own pantheon of Irish deities, separate from the Gaulish ones, known as the Tuatha Dé Danann. Members of the Tuatha Dé Danann include Ogma, the god of language and eloquence, Lug, the god of many talents, Vila, god of death, Govnu, the smith god, the Deda, the father of the Irish gods, from whom all the gods were descended, the Morrigan, triple goddess and goddess of battle, Manannán mac Lir, the sea god, and Nuada Ergetlam, the silver-handed leader of the Tuatha Dé Danann. You know, deities that are distinctly Irish with no, wait, what's happening? What's going on with that chart? Oh, right. You see, some of the Irish gods have possible parallels or cognates with the aforementioned Celtic gods, which makes sense given that the mythology of Ireland, or at least the version we inherited, was created by, or at least very heavily influenced by, the Celts. Different Celts, these were Gaelic or Goidelic-speaking Celts, not Gaulish-speaking Celts, but Celts nonetheless. And when their Celtic language and culture arrived in Ireland, likely during the Iron Age, new meanings were attached to the dolmens and tumuli that had adorned the Irish landscape since the Stone Age. These megaliths became the homes of the gods and portals to the otherworld. That's essentially how Irish mythology was born, and that leads us to the second way one can think about Celtic mythology. Because if Irish mythology is also an ancient Celtic storytelling tradition concerning the activities of divine beings, which it is, then one could easily make the argument that Irish mythology is a form of or subcategory of Celtic mythology. And I, for one, wouldn't argue with that. In fact, I'll gladly make the argument for that. Celtic mythology, the ultimate umbrella term. At the end of the day, or the Iron Age as it were, Irish mythology can be considered a branch of Celtic mythology similar to how Catholicism is a branch of the broader religious tradition of Christianity. No, that's not a perfect analogy, but the takeaway is that Celtic mythology can be used as an umbrella term to refer to all of the mythologies of the different Celtic tribes. So in addition to the Gaulish-speaking Celts who lived in Gaul and the Gaelic-speaking Celts who settled in Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, you've got the Brittonic-speaking Celts who settled in Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany, the boy who lived in what is now northern Italy and Austria and Hungary and the Czech Republic, the Celtiberians who lived in what is now central Spain, the Galeci in Portugal and Galicia and western Asturias, the Galatians in Turkey, and the Lepanti up in the Alps. Yes, all of those tribes spoke Celtic languages that originated with a common Proto-Celtic progenitor. And language, of course, is elemental to what it means to be Celtic. Remember, the Celts were not a continuous lineage of people, meaning, for example, that the Gaelic speakers who settled in Ireland were not genetic descendants of the original Proto-Celtic peoples who likely emerged in Central Europe in the Late Bronze Age. Celtic isn't a race or ethnicity, it's a culture, and we can map the spread of that culture both through language and mythology. The Gauls, the Gaels, the Britons, the Boii, the Celtiberians, the Galeci, the Galatians, the Lepanti, they all practiced some form of what scholars call the ancient Celtic religion, more commonly known as Celtic paganism. And while in the majority of cases, don't worry, we'll get to the exceptions, there are no surviving written accounts of the Celtic mythologies, plural, associated with these religions, we can still glean their existence from archaeological evidence. And we can speculate based on what we find in the manuscripts that have survived, specifically those associated with the Irish and Welsh traditions. Indeed, when we look at Irish mythology and Welsh mythology side by side, we find many similarities between their characters and narratives, despite the fact that one came from a Gaelic Celtic tradition and the other from a Brittonic Celtic tradition. For example, the famed Irish hero Finn McCool has a parallel in the Welsh hero Gwyn ap Nudd. In Old Irish, Finn meant white or fair, while in Old Welsh, Gwyn meant the same thing, white or fair. Same word, different Celtic language. This pattern continues with the Irish sea god Mennan mac Lir, mac Lir meaning son of the sea, who has a watery Welsh doppelganger in Monadon fab Lir. Then there's the leader of the Irish gods, Nuada Ergetlam, Nuada of the silver arm or hand, who has a parallel in the Welsh character Nudla Errant, Nud of the silver arm or hand, who in the myths ruled all of Britain. It's likely that Nuada and Nud, later called Lud, were both derived from an earlier Celtic god Nodens, who was worshipped in pre-Roman Britain. And I'd be remiss not to mention that a one Mr. J.R.R. Tolkien once visited the ruins of a temple to Nodens located at Dwarf's Hill, a site known for its network of tunnels and iron deposits and inscriptions that talk about a cursed ring. You can't make this up. Well, I mean you can. You know what I mean. As far as I can tell, it was Tolkien who first drew the connection between Nodens and the Irish Nuada of the Silver Hand, who in turn inspired Tolkien's character Celebrimbor, the elven smith, whose name means, you guessed it, Silver Hand. Anyway, the point I was trying to make before I went off down this hobbit hole is that there is clearly some connective tissue between Welsh and Irish and Gaulish mythologies. Back to the chart. The Welsh Ufid Fabdon, the Irish Ogma, the Gaulish Ogmios, possible cognates. The Welsh Lugh, the Irish Lug, the Gaulish Lugus, possible cognates. The Welsh Belimar, the Irish Bila, the Gaulish Belinus, possible cognates. The Welsh Gofanon, the Irish Govnu, the Gaulish Gobanus, possible cognates. The Welsh Rhiannon, the Irish Morgan, the Gaulish Epona, possible cognates. Now, originally I envisioned the Gauls as sort of being the founders of Celtic mythology who then passed the torch onto the Irish and Welsh. However, when we look at how the different Celtic languages actually evolved, branching off from Proto-Celtic, regardless of whether you go with the P/Q Celtic classification system or the Insular/Continental classification system, the end result is the same. Like the Irish language itself, which evolved independently of the Gaulish language, Irish mythology likely evolved independently of Gaulish mythology. And this points to the likelihood that there was once a common Celtic mythology or Proto-Celtic mythology that went hand in hand, or word for word, with the Proto-Celtic language. To quote historian Peter Beresford Ellis's A Dictionary of Irish Mythology, the fact that one can see relationships and counterparts demonstrates that Irish mythology is not a separate entity from the rest of the Celtic world. In it, we find echoes of a common Celtic mythological, religious, and perhaps historical experience. Irish mythology, the best preserved form of Celtic mythology. Historian Thomas Cahill famously argued that following the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Irish effectively saved Western civilization by copying and preserving important texts. Imagine an Irish monk up in his stone tower surrounded by ink and vellum. He's pulled up his ladder to prevent Viking marauders from getting inside. It's probably no exaggeration to say that actions such as these helped preserve Irish mythology for future generations. Now, did the Christian scribes who recorded the Irish myths we know and love today take a few liberties here and there? Of course they did. The Christian influence is readily apparent in the texts. Just take a look at the Leber Gabála Érenn, or the Book of the Taking of Ireland, often referred to as the Book of Invasions. Dated to the 11th century, the book details the arrivals of the different mythical races of Ireland and concludes with the Milesians, Celtic speakers from Spain, displacing the Irish gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and sending them underground. But interestingly, the Leber Gabála Érenn tells us that Ireland's very first wave of settlers is led by Noah's granddaughter, Cessair, who also lends that group their name, the Cessair. And yes, by Noah, I mean Old Testament Noah with the flood and the ark and the animals. In other texts, it's shown that the hero Finn McCool's lineage can be traced back to Mil España, king of Spain, namesake of the Milesians, and back to Queen Scoda of Egypt, namesake of Scotland, and all the way back to Adam and Eve. Later, Finn's son Oisin, Ireland's greatest poet who disappeared to Tir na Nog, the land of youth or the land of promise, for 300 years, can be found rubbing elbows with none other than St. Patrick. So yeah, while Christian monks did much to preserve Irish mythology, it's obvious that what they handed down to us isn't the purest form of this Celtic storytelling tradition. As with other Celtic peoples, it seems the Gaels in Ireland, and specifically their Druid class, had a taboo against writing down sacred knowledge. Thus, their religious stories were only shared orally prior to the arrival of Christianity. To quote Celtic scholar Georges Dautin, it is probable that the most ancient pieces of the epic literature of Ireland were written before the middle of the 7th century. But how long previously they had been preserved by oral tradition, this is a point that is difficult to estimate. The 4 cycles of Irish mythology. Today, scholars organize Irish mythology into 4 distinct chronological phases or cycles: the mythological cycle, the Ulster cycle, the Finian cycle, and the King cycle. Let's run through them one by one. 1. The mythological cycle. Stories in the mythological cycle concern themselves primarily with the various races of gods and godlike people who successively invade and inhabit Ireland in the pre-Christian era. These are, in order, the Cessair, the Partholonians, the Numidians, the Firbolg, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the Milesians. And of course, just like a phase in a modern cinematic universe, every storytelling cycle needs its big bad. In the case of the mythological cycle, that's Baelor of the Evil Eye, a monster with a humongous fiery eye that can vaporize entire armies. Baelor is the leader of the Fomorians, who originated from beneath the earth, and yeah, if this is all starting to sound familiar, it's because Tolkien read all of this stuff too. Think about it, the Tuatha Dé Danann are the mystical elves who recognize that the Age of Men, the Milesians, is upon them, so they must go to Valinor, the Undying Lands, which sounds an awful lot like Tir na Nog, the Land of Youth. Anyway, the survival of these myths hinges largely on 2 medieval manuscripts, the aforementioned Leber Gabála Érenn and the metrical Din Senchus, Lore of Places. Popular stories from the mythological cycle include the Children of Lear, which sees the titular Tuatha Dé Danann sea god, in inspiration for Shakespeare's King Lear, fathering 4 children who are turned into swans by his jealous second wife, and the Wooing of Etain, in which the titular princess falls in love with the god Medir of the Tuatha Dé Danann, but then his angry ex transforms Etain into a bejeweled fly. Yeah, there's a whole lot of transforming into animals in this cycle and in Irish mythology in general. Speaking of animals, Etain is sometimes given the epithet Ecraid, meaning horse rider, suggesting a possible connection to the Gaulish Epona and the Welsh Rhiannon. 2. The Ulster cycle. The Ulster cycle, aka the Red Branch cycle, concerns the warriors known as the Red Branch who defend Ulster during the reign of Conor MacNessa. The main stories of the cycle comprise the epic Táin Bó Cúailnge, which has been described as the Irish Iliad. The Táin, as it's known for short, sees Queen Maeve and her husband King Ailill of Connacht wage war against Ulster, all for the sake of the prized stud Don Cooley, the Brown Bull of Cooley. The primary hero of this cycle is Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Cullen, also called the Hound of Ulster, who is sometimes compared to Achilles, but who is definitely more like the Irish Hulk. The myths of the Ulster cycle are preserved in 2 12th century texts, the Book of the Dun Cow and the Book of Leinster. 3. The Finian cycle. The Finian cycle chronicles the adventures of the hero Finn McCool and the Finians, also known as the Fianna, who are a band of warriors responsible for guarding the High King of Ireland. Within the Finian cycle, we find the Macna Marta Finn, or Boyhood Deeds of Finn, a collection of stories chronicling the hero's rise from forced exile and fosterhood to his feasting on a supernatural fish, the Salmon of Knowledge, to him as a 10-year-old defeating a fire-breathing, literally otherworldly monster with a magical spear on Samhain, thus saving Tara, the seat of the High King, from certain destruction. But arguably the most famous story from the Finian cycle, the pursuit of Diarmid and Grania, is set chronologically much later when Finn is an old man. In the story, Grania, Finn's betrothed, runs off with a young dashing warrior of the Fianna, Diarmid Ua Dubna, or Diarmid of the Loved Spot, foster son of the love god Angus. Shenanigans ensue, including Diarmid meeting his demise at the at the tusk of his stepbrother who had been turned into a magical boar. Note, the Finian cycle is also known as the Oceanic cycle after the cycle's alleged author, the aforementioned Oisin. 4. The King cycle. Also known as the cycle of kings or the historical cycle, the king cycle blurs the lines between history and myth more so than any of the earlier cycles. Geared toward providing examples of how to be a good ruler, the cycle features the likes of real historical figures such as the Irish king Brian Boru, born in 941 CE, as well as purely mythological ones, such as Labraid Longsec, the mariner who speaks, who, according to Irish legend, was an exiled High King of Ireland who lost the ability to speak after eating his father's heart. Yum. One of the most popular stories of the cycle is Bull Sweeney, the Frenzy of Sweeney, or the Madness of Sweeney. The story tells of a king of the Dalriada, Sweeney Gilt, who, after fleeing a battle, journeys through Ireland's wild places in search of peace of mind. The Irish character might have helped inspire Merlin from Arthurian legend, but it's still up for debate. FYI, I wrote a series of essays about Sweeney and Merlin and Mirrodin and the origins of the Celtic wild man of the woods motif over at irishmyths.com. Another approach to categorizing Irish myths. While the Four Cycles approach to Irish myth categorization has become ubiquitous in the study of Irish mythology, it can be a bit confusing since the Irish gods, i.e. the Tuatha Dé Danann, and their descendants can and do appear across multiple cycles. The Morrigan, for example, after playing a significant role in the mythological cycle, goes on to effectively haunt the hero Cuchulainn during the Ulster cycle and is a witness to his death. True, while some particular stories may veer more into legend or folktale or even history territory, myths, naturally, abound across all four cycles of Irish mythology, which is why it's so weird that the first cycle of Irish mythology is called the mythological cycle. And here's the thing. It hasn't always been like this. Prior to the adoption of the four cycles, chroniclers of Irish mythology organized stories into two main categories: Preamscale, chief tales, and Foscale, minor tales. According to Ellis, Preamscale stories included battles, voyages, tragedies, adventures, military expeditions, courtships, elopements, concealments, destructions, sieges, feasts, slaughters, and cattle raids. There were a lot of cattle raids. Whereas the Foscale included pursuits, visions, exiles/banishments, and lake bursts. The lake burst, or Tomhaid in Irish, is both a natural, make that supernatural phenomenon, as well as a genre of bardic story in which a lake or bay or other body of water just sort of bubbles up out of nowhere, often when someone is digging a grave. Granted, the most famous lake burst from Irish mythology, arguably, occurs at Loch Ness as a result of a giant magical horse, a gift from the aforementioned love god Angus, taking a pee. Which reminds me, Angus, son of the Data, also goes by the moniker Mac Og, young son, and has a likely cognate in the Welsh mythical figure Mabon ap Modron, as well as in the Gaulish god Mapanos, aka the Great Sun. But back to the lake eruptions. Turns out they're a pretty common story category across the Celtic world, or at least the Atlantic Celtic world, with examples appearing in medieval manuscripts in Wales, Cornwall, Brittany, and Normandy. And no, while Normandy is not considered a bastion of Celtic culture in the same way that Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany are, alongside Scotland and the Isle of Man, and occasionally Galicia and Asturias, they're considered the 6 or 8 modern Celtic nations, Normandy was, for much of its history, teeming with Gaulish tribes. So once again, we find another possible link connecting the mythologies of Gaulish-speaking Celts, Brittonic-speaking Celts, and Gaelic-speaking Celts. And once again, we catch a glimpse of a theoretical common Celtic mythology that would ultimately seed the creation of Irish mythology. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment, and basically just tap all of the shiny buttons, and by the end of it, make sure you are subscribed to the Irish Myths channel. That really helps. And if you want to learn more about Irish and Celtic paganism, check out my book, Samhain in Your Pocket, a tiny little book about the Celtic origins of Halloween. My name is I.E. Kneverday, editor of the short story collection Neon Druid and creator of irishmyths.com. Thanks for coming out.